Hello, everyone, and hello, Professor Preston. This is my interpretation of the analysis of the subtext of the Metamorphosis. After reading through this story and looking at the deeper meaning and looking through what I truly think the meaning of this story was about, I came down to the idea that it's the subtext of the Metamorphosis is a revelation of an existential crisis, considering Gregor's metamorphosis or transition really illustrates the idea of his own gradual mental breakdown and his mental decline. I feel like there was a few different things and a few different questions to be asked to understand and to why I came up with this this analysis of the subtext. To begin with, I feel like there was some obvious content in the story itself that was repeated. There was multiple use of rhetorical questions. There was multiple times throughout the story where Gregor showed his use of self-doubt. He was constantly in a sense of feeling that he was always doing something wrong or always in fault, and always something he was always doing something that was on his part. And he also had a huge sense of hopelessness throughout the entire story. He just seemed to be in a bad position and stayed there for a long time. And he also began to lose a bit of his own humanity through his transition, even though maybe in the idea of the subtext, it really wasn't a physical transition, but more of a mental. But he began to lose his own humanity through it because he was so busy worrying about what was wrong instead of trying to find the positive inside the darkness. There's also a few ideas that were compared and contrasted. One of the things that helped me come to this conclusion was the idea that he was of comparing and contrasting was his life as a human versus his life as an insect. You could see that there was a major decline from his life as a human to the insect. He began to people began to shut him out, and he began to do the same. He was just in a bad place, and you could see the transition from human to insect was just horrible for him. You could also see a major decline in his relationship with his family and the people around him. He just began to not interact with them, and they began to resent him, and he began to resent himself because of that. Overall, his perspective also began to change. He just saw life more as this troublesome, annoying thing he has to deal with instead of an opportunity to do better and an opportunity to strive. There's also a major text shift throughout this story. I personally think that the text shift was around the time of the attack from his father towards Gregor. Not only was he physically damaged, but he was also mentally damaged, and this was kind of the start of his very downhill and very fast mental decline. This also led to a major sense of resentment towards himself. He began to really hate himself after that moment. He began to see why he was such a big problem to his family, and that negative perspective and negative outlook on his life was just a terrible downfall for him. And then there was also a few questions that were kind of good to ask throughout the story of like what kind of happened here and where. One of them was, what does the insect itself symbolize? Like, what does Gregor's transition symbolize? And I personally think that kind of went into the idea of his mental decline. And then another one would be what would happen if his family was a little bit more accepting of his transition. I believe he would have definitely gone through it a little bit better and been able to move up on top and not go down into the place that he went into. And then a lot of people also begin to ask, what was the actual reason for his death? And lastly, if he deserves sympathy in the first place. If he deserves sympathy for all of what happened, is this his own fault? And lastly, there's a theme that comes out of this story and a few ideas coming from that. One being his sense of alienation, two being the battle between his mind and his body, three being his suppression of will to do anything and to make an effort to have a better life, and lastly, his just overall difficulty of transformation. It was a really rough time for him, and it just showed throughout the story. Overall, though, I think all of these aspects come together to show that the subtext of the story is nothing but the revelation of his own existential crisis and his own mental battle that he has throughout the story. It's quite clear that he slowly went downhill into a bad rut in a bad place, and mentally he just couldn't handle it anymore. That's it, and thank you guys. Appreciate it.